Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a huge question that has captivated people for centuries. How did governments actually get their power? I mean, we take the existence of the state totally for granted today, but where did it all begin? Were we guided by these beautiful, rational, philosophical ideals? Or was the origin of the state rooted in a much more gritty, aggressive historical reality? Let's unpack both sides of this coin. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Locke's contracts, move to Rousseau and the general will, do some critiquing of the contract, explore the evolutionary and patriarchal theories, and finally, look at the force theory. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Locke's contracts. In his two treatises on civil government, John Locke argued that originally, in a pre-political state of nature, people were completely free and equal. But there was a catch. Society still really needed three crucial things: settled law, a judge, and an executive power to enforce decisions. So to get those things, people partially gave up their natural liberty. Locke favored limited government and representative democracy, For him, the contract had a very limited purpose, just to protect life, liberty, and property. He actually saw this as two separate contracts, one that creates civil society and a second one that creates the government itself. And crucially, if that government ever fails to protect those rights, the people absolutely retain the right to revolt. Moving right along to Section 2, let's look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the general will. The contrast here is super interesting. While Locke splits the contract into two to build a practical legal structure, Rousseau looks at it completely differently. He asks a much more foundational question: how can we be free and yet still live together? His answer is that individuals have to submit their private, self-interested wills to a collective will aimed at the common good. To really get Rousseau, you have to look at his starting point in his discourse on the origin and foundation of inequality. He believed men were born inherently good, the noble savage, but were eventually corrupted by civilization. So his system is built entirely on reason and direct participation. He was trying to reconcile authority with freedom. For Rousseau, absolutely no one has a natural right to govern anyone else. Power has to come from the collective. He summed it up perfectly in his own words right here. Basically, each of us puts our person and all our power under the supreme direction of the general will. Think about the weight of that for a second. You aren't just a subject anymore. You become an indivisible, active piece of the sovereign power. But let's pause for a second and hit Section 3, critiquing the contract. As inspiring as these ideas are, they face massive scrutiny in the real world. Because you really have to ask yourself, did this actually happen? Did our ancestors ever literally sit around a campfire and sign a legal document? And if the state gets its power from this supposed contract, what exactly is the limit of its power today? Well, critics are quick to point out that there is zero historical fact to back this up. There was never a literal moment when people signed a contract. Some even call it bad philosophy because by saying people can just break the contract, it might encourage revolution and anarchy. Plus, there's a huge legal headache. How does an agreement made by past generations carry legally binding force on generations that aren't even born yet? But look, despite those glaring flaws, we can't dismiss the theory. It undeniably laid the foundation for modern democracy, and the tension is still very real today. The limits of state power are constantly being tested in real-world legal situations, like the recent J.R. Raj and Benix cases. We're still actively trying to figure out exactly where the state's power ends. Since the contract theory falls a bit short historically, let's move to Section 4, the evolutionary and patriarchal theories. This is how states likely actually formed over time. The evolutionary theory lays out a highly logical progression. It starts small. Step 1, a primitive family where one person emerges as leader. Over decades, that family grows into a clan. That's Step 2. Step 3, the clan expands into a tribe. And the crucial final step, the state is officially born the moment that tribe stops moving, settles permanently in one designated area, and claims it as their own. Running closely alongside that is the patriarchal theory, advocated by Sir Henry Maine. This defines the state as a conglomeration of several families that developed specifically under the strict control and authority of the eldest male. Maine argued that three distinct factors cause this: male kinship, permanent marriages, and paternal authority. Essentially, dad's absolute household power scaled up to a king's power. Critics, however, push back hard on this. They point out that the state's origin is vastly more complex and involves multiple factors, like family, religion, political necessity, and yes, force, not just patriarchy acting alone.
And speaking of force, that brings us to Section 5, the force theory.
Associated with thinkers like Oppenheimer and Jenks, this perspective drops all the idealism. It argues that wars and aggressive conquests by powerful tribes were the true principal driving factors behind the creation of the state. It's a brutal view. The physically stronger establish authority over the weaker. The absolutely strongest person becomes the chief. The powerful conquer the weak. And this process just keeps going until a victorious tribe secures a definite territory. Under this theory, force is an essential feature of the state, and power is its own complete justification. Might literally makes right. Of course, critics call this out, arguing that it unfairly takes one single historical factor and blows it totally out of proportion. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we've traveled from the lofty ideals of Locke and Rousseau right down to the aggressive realities of the force theory. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. When you look at your own state today, is it truly rooted in the hopeful consent of a contract, or are we just living under the highly organized remnants of evolutionary force?